Jason Hensley was born in California and lives in Los Angeles, and for many years has been a member of the Christadelphian Church or ecclesia at Simi Hills. Jason is the principal of a small private school, Heritage College in California, and a professor of religion and Holocaust studies at the Gratz Academy. He frequently lectures about Holocaust, as well as Bible, Christianity, Judaism, and related topics throughout North America. Jason joins Wilderness Conversations to discuss a book he authored entitled Part of the Family: Christadelphians, the Kindertransport and Rescue from the Holocaust. The book concerns the Kindertransport and in particular the role Christadelphians played in assisting hundreds of Jewish children as persecution broke out just before Britain declared war. In 1938 through to 1939, via a movement known as Kindertransport, thousands of Jewish children were taken from Nazi-occupied territories to safety in Great Britain. They came to a new family, a new country, a new life. Approximately 250 of these children were sponsored by Christadelphians, and they became part of the family. Their stories of survival, triumph over evil, and hope should never be forgotten. And Jason writes, and I quote, "Often the Holocaust is considered in terms of statistics, how many perished, how many were affected, so much so that at times individual stories are lost in the numbers. This," referring to the book, "examines the experiences of individuals who came to England as children and lived with Christadelphians." In Jason's book, Part of the Family, he brings to light details of some of these child survivors and their families. An introductory quote is provided just before the table of contents. It's a quote from John Thomas from Elpis, Israel, and this was written long before these times. In fact, it was written in 1849. And John Thomas writes, "I know not whether the men who at present contrive the foreign policy of Britain entertain the idea of assuming the sovereignty of the Holy Land and of promoting its colonisation by Jews. Their present tensions, however, are of no importance one way or the other, because they will be compelled by events soon to happen to do what, under existing circumstances, heaven and earth combined would not move them to attempt. The finger of God has indicated a course to be pursued by Britain which cannot be evaded, and which her counsellors will not only be willing but eager to adopt when the crisis comes upon them. To Britain, then, the prophet calls as the protector of the Jewish nation in the evening tide trouble, and commands it to send messengers and swift vessels because the crisis is urgent, to plant Israel as, I quote, an ensign upon the mountains." That's from Isaiah 18 verse 3. John Thomas, Elpis, Israel, in 1849. The foreword of the book is written by Melissa Hacker, the president of the Kindertransport Association. And she writes, "The Kindertransports to Great Britain operated for a short period of time from December the 1st, 1938 to September the 1st, 1939, the 9 months before the outbreak of World War II, and affected a limited and far too small number of children. But the lessons we can learn from this are many and great. Throughout Great Britain, individuals with no connection to continental Europe took action, organising, knocking on doors to find foster homes, creating hostels and schools, raising funds and welcoming children into their homes and families. Children who in many cases did not speak English had suffered terribly in their hometowns, having lived under Nazi rule, deprived of the rights of citizens for months or years. These children had not experienced the kindness of strangers for much of their young lives, and the welcome given by the Christadelphians who took them in must have been much appreciated and a healing change." Jason, thanks very much for joining us on Wilderness Conversations.
Thank you.
I'm interested in a little bit of your background and what sparked your interest in, I guess, Israel in general, and in particular the subject of the Kindertransport.
Well, growing up as a Christadelphian, I always knew that Israel was important. You know, our founding book is Elpis Israel, or the hope of Israel. So that always kind of stuck with me. And I remember hearing consistently that our hope was the hope of Israel. So I always had that kind of in my mind. And the Holocaust in particular struck me because it was such a monumental event. Number one, because it related to the people of God, and because in some interpretations, the Holocaust is really what laid the groundwork for the creation of the state of Israel. So I kind of had those things in the back of my mind, and I was interested growing up in the Holocaust. What really got me interested in this topic in particular was in 2015, I attended a conference called the Belfer Conference for Educators. And it was at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. So it was there, and it was basically about how do you teach the Holocaust well, and how do you bring something of this magnitude to students and do it in a respectful and a helpful kind of way. And I felt really humbled after the whole experience that I kind of came into it thinking, oh, I know a lot about the Holocaust. I've read a lot of books on it and watched a lot of documentaries. And I left thinking, wow, this is so much bigger than I thought, so much more complex than I thought it was. And I felt very humbled by the whole thing, and very moved to try and unearth some more of these stories. I think what really struck me was this fact that that the Holocaust is really, the way that we know about it and remember it in a lot of ways is through collections of individual stories of people telling, here's what happened to me, here's what happened to my family, here's what my family did. And just this recognition that because the Holocaust was so huge, there are so many of these stories, and a lot of them haven't been told. So this conference kind of prompted me to that. And what that ended up leading to is I went and I got my master's in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and then went and got a PhD in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And now I teach it at university. And I've written these books about it. So that kind of is what really sparked the interest. It was this big desire to really preserve the stories, and recognizing that the community that I'm a part of, that Christadelphians have this connection to rescue, that just really lit a fire. It at first it was kind of like, I want to find stories to tell so that they don't get lost. And then as I realized that this community has these stories to tell, I felt like, whoa, like this has to be done, right now. And I there were nights where I'd sleep like 2 hours or something, because I was so excited to write this book and get these stories told.
What took you to the conference in the first place? And were you already a teacher? Because you mentioned the subject of teaching children and adults about these stories.
Yeah, so I was already a teacher. I got my teaching credential in 2013. And so I had been a teacher for a couple of years. I was working as a principal at the Christadelphian Heritage School in Los Angeles. And I kind of, what I do at the school is I really just fill in whatever place we don't have a teacher to teach. So sometimes I teach middle school language, sometimes I teach algebra, all kinds of stuff. And a sister from Baltimore emailed me saying that the teachers at Heritage might be interested in this conference, and that she had gone as a Sunday school teacher a few years back, and they accepted her as a Sunday school teacher and let her come to it. And so I as it turned out, I was going to be on the East Coast for a Bible school at that same time. The timing worked out like perfectly. So even though the other teachers weren't able to go, I was able to head out, and that it really set life on a totally different trajectory than I expected.
I'd like to discuss some of the early premises of the book, which you get into before getting into the actual stories. And in particular, I guess the traditional or doctrinal view of the Christadelphians going right back with regard to Israel. And you, without labouring it, I think you do a nice job. You don't labour it at all, but you make the point and you make the contrast between what was actually reasonably common in Protestant Christianity at the time, which was to a large extent quite anti-Semitic, which might actually come as a surprise to some people. In one of your first chapters, Christadelphian and the Jews, you quote from an address given by Brother C.C. Walker on a Sunday morning. And let me just read the first paragraph. It says, "On this occasion, we remember Christ, especially as the Saviour of Israel. We are to have a special collection for the Jewish Refugee Relief Fund, and well we may for the salvation of the Jews. This is not the first time we've had such a special Jewish relief collection. 57 years ago, in 1882, on the occasion of the Russian persecutions, we had such a collection. And the late Brother Roberts, in the Sunday morning exhortation, the Christadelphian of April 1882, made our indebtedness to Israel and our acceptance of the hope of Israel the basis of his appeal." And he goes on and shows how that these appeals have been happening through the Christadelphian community from way back in the late 1800s right through to the Second World War.
Yeah, I think that that's huge. You know, it really shows the recognition that our community has had to our indebtedness to Judaism, that our beliefs are based upon it. You know, we have Jewish roots. Christianity started as a Jewish sect, right? And I think it's a recognition of that. And as you had mentioned, you know, there were a lot of Christian communities at the time that had kind of gotten away from that idea, and in fact gone in the other direction and fought against the Jews, fought against Jewish communities, tried to create persecution and distance between the Christian community and the Jewish community. So yeah, I think it was particularly at that time a unique thing. And now today, you know, since the Holocaust, post-Holocaust, a number of Christian groups have said, whoa, you know, what was in our history? And like the Lutheran Church has apologized for what Martin Luther said about the Jews. Yeah. So a lot of churches have gone back and recognized that was not good.
Well, of course, the crystal knot, you can probably help my pronunciation of that, which is the occasion of the when the Jews were persecuted, or sort of really almost the starting point, I guess, or the trigger of both the Holocaust and indeed the Kindertransport, was on the birthday of Luther. I hadn't sort of connected those dates before. You make that point in the book.
That's one of those weird kind of connections, you know. You wonder, is there something to this? Like the Lutheran bishop of Thuringia, as I mentioned in the book, he made the connection and he said, you know, this is clearly a birthday present for Luther, right? And Hitler does really exalt Luther as like one of the change makers of the world. So it's possible. What happened on Kristallnacht definitely was very similar to what Luther had written in his book on the Jews and their lies. So, you know, it seems like that's probably not coincidental, but, you know, Hitler didn't say anything specific about it.
You mentioned the fact that Christadelphians have this sort of underlying love of the Jewish people, Israel, because of, you know, obviously the connection of Judaism through into Christianity. How's that been borne out over the years, apart from what we've got in front of us here? It went back before the Kindertransport, largely in terms of collections and that sort of support. Was there any other ways that you're aware of?
So, to the best of my knowledge, it was largely with collections. There was a woman, as I wrote about in the beginning, named Alice Davis, and she was sort of sponsored by Christadelphians to be there on the ground in Palestine at the time. That, to the best of my understanding, is what Christadelphians were doing.
I've got the I guess it's a letter that was written by Brother John Carter, and he says, "My Lord, I have pleasure in sending a cheque for £1,000, which sum has been contributed by the Christadelphian ecclesias, largely in the British Isles, and other readers of the Christadelphian, to the fund which bears your name for the relief of Jewish refugees. Will you be good enough to earmark the sum in equal proportions for the relief of German Jewry and Jewish refugee children?" And I sort of had a bit of a look at that value, and it's something like $200,000 in today's money. It's an extraordinary donation, isn't it?
Wow. Yeah, that's huge.
And this was just one of the donations. There were many others as well.
One of the things I've done as well is gone through the Advocate magazine. I just haven't compiled the data yet, but I mean that was mostly the North American magazine for the unamended community at the time, and there's similar kinds of things there. So it would be interesting to bring together all the data. I have it all, but I haven't been able to go through it. It's like pages and pages worth, all these quotations.
On the night of the Kristallnacht, which prompted a lot of, I guess it was the night where a lot of the Jewish people in Germany and other places realised that their belief or their faith that they would not be persecuted, or the fact that they were integrated into German and other countries' society, they realised that that was not going to be enough, that they were going to be separated out. They were going to be recognised as Jews and treated as such, and that wasn't going to be good news. To the extent where these families actually virtually gave up their children, which you almost need to pause and think what that means. They gave up their children and sent them to another land just to save them, knowing to a lesser or great extent that they may never see them again. That was that moment of realization, which is almost incomprehensible to think about, really.
Kristallnacht was really the impetus for all of that, because it suddenly brought into perspective how dangerous and how terrifying the situation had become. Yeah, as you said, it was where families realized that they needed to do anything they could to get anybody out, because it wasn't going to end well. So for a long time, people have been holding out, for 6 years, well, five years, going into 6, depending on when they went on the Kindertransport, but thinking that, Germany was a, quote, civilized country, that this kind of thing wouldn't happen. And then when Kristallnacht happened, that whole paradigm shattered.
How did the Kindertransport then get started? What was it the idea of the British and the idea of children? Where did that all come from?
Yeah, so there's a few factors there. It was the middle of the Great Depression, right? So that was one piece of this. People were afraid that if they allowed adults into the country, then adults would take jobs. Okay. So that was sort of the idea there, that if you allow children in, the children aren't going to take people's positions. And people didn't expect a long war, so they thought if we let children in, they'll be able to go back. Well, I mean, some people didn't even expect a war at that point, right? So they figured if we let children in, they'll go back at some point soon, something like that. And they didn't realize it was going to go till 1945. So that was the children piece. The reason it happened in Great Britain is sort of interesting. Some people say that Neville Chamberlain felt remorse over what had happened at the Munich conference.
Oh, right.
So he went to Munich, essentially bartered Czechoslovakia for peace.
Yep.
Even though he had no claim to Czechoslovakia at all. So he barters Czechoslovakia for peace, gets that agreement, infamously says there will be peace in our time, waves the agreement around, and then realizes that that's not going to happen. So some people believe that Chamberlain essentially pushed this legislation through Parliament. Whatever it was, the whole world was just blown away. The international community was really shocked by what Germany did. It wasn't a thing that happened in Europe, that a country attacked its own citizens. I mean, the Jews weren't necessarily, they had lost citizenship technically at that point. The Nuremberg laws had taken it away, but still, to attack people that are living in your own country was just a thing that didn't happen. So that was, it was very shocking. There was a big uproar all throughout the world. It was on the front page of a ton of newspapers. What's interesting as far as the United States is concerned, so this is really Great Britain. This is Great Britain's good track record here, because they messed up with the Munich conference, but then they ended up letting in 10,000 children in Kindertransport. Initially, they said as many as can come. we can find sponsors for. And it ended up being 10,000. In the United States, a senator named Robert Wagner proposed that the United States let in 20,000 children. The same kind of idea. It was basically like a U.S. Kindertransport. And that bill died in committee before it even made it to Congress. So it didn't even get to the floor of Congress to get debated. The committee just killed it, said, no, that's not going to happen here.
When the World War started, then that was the end of that anyway.
Yep. Yeah.
I was curious. I've always made the assumption, to some extent anyway, that no one really knew what was happening in Germany until after the war. You know, all these images of the concentration camps being opened and everyone was staggered by what was going on. But there was an understanding of what the Germans were doing to the Jewish people even before the war started, hence the Kindertransport.
That is a very, very interesting question. So in volume 2 of Part of the Family, there's an opening quote by H.P. Mansfield, and it's from, I think it's 1942. And he talks about the Treblinka death camp, which is pretty astonishing that he was writing those kind of things at that point. There's a lot of controversy, though, regarding what was believed. So people knew about what was happening to Jews up till up through the early 1940s. But in 1941, all of the euphemisms that Germany was using, like, we're relocating people to the east, things like that, that kind of pulled the wool over people's eyes. And they could have found out. There were definitely channels, diplomatic channels that were open, and people and nations like the Vatican, the United States, these nations were hearing about what's happening. But a lot of times the channels got shut down because, like, the State Department at the US just said, it's not happening. That's not, it can't actually be happening, that kind of thing. So it's a weird sort of story. I look at the United States, I guess, because it's debated, like, the US's role as far as what they could have done. But in 1944, Franklin Roosevelt established the War Refugee Board, and that ended up saving hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews, because in 1944 it was finally acknowledged these death camps are real. But they knew about it in 42. So the question is, what would have happened if somebody had actually done something in 42 when people knew about it? So yeah, it's very weird. But, like, some of the quotations, though, that I have in there, they mention using poison gas, and it's in the 1930s. So it's weird looking at some of the sources. I think it comes down to some sources were deemed not credible, but it actually turns out that they were right. So I think that's some of the things. I mean, even when you look at, like, Anne Frank was in hiding listening to the BBC, and she mentions that Jews were being gassed. So people knew stuff, but it was almost like the government didn't want to acknowledge it, didn't feel like the sources were credible, that kind of thing.
And you wonder whether the stories were just so horrendous and horrific that no one actually really believed that it could be true.
Yes.
Hard to say. And then, of course, rolled over the top of that, there's a world war going on. Well, certainly was about to start.
That's the other piece. Yeah. So
the British passed this legislation, which enabled or welcomed children, I guess, to come. But of course, the catch was, or the requirement was, before each child came, there had to be a sponsor who was prepared to commit to housing and feeding and schooling and looking after those children. So that almost became the limiting factor, I guess. And so then the work began by, obviously many, many wonderful volunteers to go and literally knock on doors and ask people to make this incredible commitment.
Yeah, it was largely in the Christadelphian world, it was largely done by Alan Overton. So he very much spearheaded the whole thing. He went around to different ecclesias and he spoke and just said, God's people are suffering. Who's going to take a child? And he was, I've been told he was extremely persuasive. So he kept pushing to see who was willing to take somebody in.
One of the things that comes out in your stories and the stories of the people that you interview is just how difficult life was at the time. And that sort of struck me, because I sort of thought, if this was happening today, you could probably take many, many children, and you could, you'd even hire a place to put them, or, you could put them at Heritage College, or, get a big building and house them. And, there's all sorts of things you could do, and there's money around. But these were people that were struggling to find work. They had tiny houses. Many of them were out of work, in fact, and there was no spare money. Like these people just took these children on when they really had very little to offer them, and were struggling to feed themselves in many cases.
It was really striking to me when I started talking to the people who were involved in this, and sort of hearing what the Christadelphian foster families ended up doing. Because I think a lot of times when we think about the Kindertransport, we think about the drama of the parents giving up their child. And it's good. We should think about that, because that's a big piece of this. But what I hadn't considered was the drama of the families that were willing to take a child in too, of recognizing sort of what you're saying, that these weren't all families with huge homes. They weren't all affluent. And in some cases, they were taking on teenagers who couldn't speak their language. Well, in most cases, the kids couldn't speak their language. They came in things like lederhosen. They were wearing their German clothes when they got there. And so the families had to try and get them new English clothes so that they wouldn't stand out. People didn't want to look German in England at that time.
Yeah.
So it was quite a situation, attempting to teach English, attempting to get this to figure out how do you work your family culture with a new family member. And even the religion piece too was tricky. Christadelphian families wanted to be respectful about the fact that they were taking in somebody who was Jewish. They didn't want to just say, well, now you're a Christadelphian or something like that, because all of this was done under duress, right? Like their parents were sending them over and just hoping for the best. So in a lot of cases, Christadelphian families actually wrote to the parents of the child saying, one of the things we do as a family is we go to the meetings on Sunday, and we'd like to take your child too. We can't really leave them at home, but we want to make sure that that's okay with you. So it's kind of interesting to hear about all of those attempts to not force faith on the children.
You spend quite a bit of time in the book. It was obvious to me when I was reading the book, you sort of almost were overemphasizing that fact. It was obviously something of quite interest to you to see how Christadelphians sort of dealt with that challenge, with trying to show these German Jewish children what it meant to be a Christadelphian, but by the same token, allowing them to make a choice and to see and make their own decisions at the end of the day.
Yes. And I think the reason it gets emphasized so much is just because I think two factors. Historically, like, it just wasn't that way with Christianity. Right? Christians and Jews have a very bad historical relationship of forced conversions.
Okay, I didn't realize that.
Judaism is very sensitive to the idea of Christians converting them.
Right.
Yeah. So that's like a really big thing. So to have that historical record of Christadelphians weren't forcing this, that's really big for relations with Judaism. So that's a big thing. And the other is because in a lot of situations in the Kindertransport, that is what happened with other Christian groups.
Oh, okay.
It was very much like, this child is going to come here and they are going to be part of this religion. That's that. If you don't like it, don't send your kid, that kind of thing. So it was, I was talking to Rella. So her story is in the book there. And one of the things that she mentioned was that her family was trying to get her a place to go. And they found her a place in the Netherlands. But it was a very Catholic family. And the family said, if Rella comes here, she's going to be Catholic and she is going to sing in our choir and she's not going to be Jewish anymore. The end. And Rella said that even though that was a ticket for her to live, her grandmother, who lived with them, took the letter and tore it up into pieces and said, "You're not going."
Yeah.
So
interesting.
It's yeah.
In the book, you spend most of the book actually telling the stories, which is exactly what you said. That was your goal. How did you go about finding the people and the background to these stories?
It's funny. I thought at one point it might be interesting to write like a background to part of the family because it was such a fascinating experience for me, and I thought some people might find it encouraging. But it's kind of a crazy story. So Mark Sawyer lives in Australia now, and he had written a web page called My Big Sister Ursula. It was on Christadelphiansisters.org, and it was like this old page that he hadn't updated for years. And I stumbled across it in a Google search. And this was the only link I had at all at the beginning to Christadelphians and the Kindertransport. So I knew that there was a woman named Ursula who was taken in by the Sawyer family. And I knew that it was done by Mark Sawyer, but I didn't have contact information for anybody. And so what I ended up doing is I contacted the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and I asked, saying, "I'm looking for somebody named Ursula Mayer. Do you know anything about any survivor with that name?" Which, is crazy because there's thousands and thousands of survivors. But I emailed and asked that, and I got a response saying the best thing to do is to look in the white pages and just start calling everybody.
Oh, that's helpful. Thank you.
With that name. Yeah. And I just thought, well, that's a terrible idea. Like, I'm not going to call up and say, "Hey, are you a Holocaust survivor?
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about like the worst time of your life with me?" So I kind of tabled that and just didn't do anything with it for months. And eventually I kind of felt like something needed to happen. There were these stories that were being told, or these stories that happened that weren't being told, and they needed to be. So after a few months, I finally decided that the only thing that I could do that made any sense was to try using the white pages and just call every person in the country named Ursula Mayer. So I did. And the first person I called, I left a message saying, "My name is Jason Hensley. I am a Christadelphian. I think you might have lived with Christadelphians during World War II. If you did, I'd love to hear from you." And she called me back that night and said, "I am the Ursula Mayer who lived with Christadelphians, and I would be happy to talk to you."
That's crazy.
So that was how that happened. It was amazing. And then she gave me Mark Sawyer's phone number. So I got in contact with him, and he then gave me the numbers and the contact information of other kinder who had stayed with Christadelphians, and it just kind of blossomed out like that. And the whole thing was amazing how it happened.
So it's just a collection of people. Lots of people knew lots of different pieces of information, and you were able to go and sort of like just collect all that together.
Yes, it was fascinating to see because it just was a neat. It was a neat demonstration of our community and the way that our community works, because I just started putting like requests for information in various Christadelphian newsletters, and I started getting contacted by people all over the world. There was one really neat story where there was a kind to one of the Kindertransport children who had moved to Melbourne And I had gotten this was crazy. So the family that took care of him lived in the Olivet assisted living home in the UK. So one of the family members who had taken care of him. And when she died, her room was being cleaned out. A letter was found that was related to, I don't remember the exact details, but it was like related to the war and to this child's life. So Olivet tracks him down in Melbourne and sends this letter to him and says, this is about your life. It's yours. So they send this letter to him, and they like write a little page about it online. So I contacted them. I got his contact information and I interviewed him. And that same day, this was a crazy piece. That same day, I got an email from a brother in London named Simon Foster. And he said, Jason, I found this video that my father had made. He was really into like old time movies. And in the video, there's this scene, this transition that says, Carol and Edith from like who are refugees, something like that. And it shows the two of them and for like 15 seconds. And he said, I have no idea who they are. And I looked at it and said, Simon, I just interviewed that guy today.
All right.
That's crazy. And it was just amazing.
It was an old film with them in it, going right back to the late 1930s.
It was an old film with them in it. So what had happened was Carol, or he went by Charles now. Charles and his sister Edith had come as Kindertransport children, and Simon had this video of them from when they were in the UK, and Simon's family was connected to their rescue and everything, but they had lost touch. So Edith, Charles's sister, had moved to Israel, and she and Simon ended up meeting together after that, which is pretty cool.
That's great. I wonder if we could talk about a story or two. I read through the book. I bought your book from Amazon. Is there a favorite story, or is there a particular story that stands out to you?
Oh yeah, there definitely is. So Ursula Mayer, I already mentioned her, but she's the first one I contacted, and part of the story that she told me just will always move me, I think. In fact, it was really from her that we got the title of the book, Part of the Family. So this is a refrain that kept coming up as I was interviewing people, but it was Ursula's story that I felt like really brought this out. So she told me that she wanted me to understand how much she was part of the family. And she said, I'm going to explain this to you by telling you a story. So the story that she said was during the war, they had blackout curtains. And that way, the Germans wouldn't be able to see where any of the homes were. So at nighttime, they would black out the windows. Nobody could see any homes. They couldn't bomb the homes. The air raid wardens had the responsibility of going around and making sure that all the curtains were blacked out, or all the windows were blacked out, and that nobody was somehow shining a light so that the Germans could see it. Well, when cars would drive by the Sawyer house, the Sawyers lived on the corner and they had a bay window. So when cars would turn, their headlights would shine on the window and light up the window. And then as they turned, it would look like the lights inside the window had turned on and off. So an air raid warden noticed this and noticed that it was a pattern, that it looked like the lights were turning on and off. And he broke down the door of the Sawyer's house. And he said, somebody in this house is signaling to the Germans, and I'm going to figure out who it is. So he starts going around the house, and he finds Ursula, who's a 15-year-old German girl. And so he says, it's got to be you. And he pulls out his gun and he's about to shoot her.
Wow.
Because he's sure that she's a spy.
Yeah.
And so what she said is, at that moment, Norman Sawyer, he was the dad, Norman Sawyer got up and stood between her and the air raid warden in front of the gun and said, "You are going to shoot me first. She's innocent." And the air raid warden put his gun away and he left. And she said, "That is how much I was part of their family. I was one of their kids." And so that's why Mark wrote that post about his big sister Ursula, because that was very much the situation. And I loved how that illustrated that this was not just we're going to have somebody come and live in our house, but this was a part of the family, part of what we are as a culture, as a community.
The story also brought to attention something I'd never thought of before, and that is the difficulty not only of having a child, looking after a child, feeding a child, all of those sorts of things, but it's a German child and we're at war with Germany.
Yeah.
And that really struck me, because that would not have been easy. And there would have been probably a lot of ill feeling around about that. And very few people would have been prepared to do that. Their sons and daughters are at war. They're losing their sons, in the war effort. And here we are looking after the children of Germans, Jewish Germans, to be fair. But for many people, they would have just been seen as Germans. And that would have been not insignificant, I'm sure.
No, I think you're right. And it speaks as well to why when you talk to so many of these kinder, why they were so quick to try and learn English, so quick to get rid of their German clothes, to try and get rid of, well, in addition to that, they hated Germany, right? But I think it also just was what you're talking about, that you didn't want to be German in England when there was a war going on.
So you mentioned one person who actually took on the Christadelphian faith. Were there others, and many?
So there were a handful. I think my population was sort of skewed because because the people that I ended up interviewing, I connected with through Christadelphians.
Yeah.
So it's hard to know, particularly with the hostels. So Christadelphians ran 2 hostels. There was Littlethorn and Rugby, and that was largely run by Alan Overton. And then there was Elpis Lodge in Birmingham that was run mainly through the Christadelphian office. And the people who went to those, particularly Elpis Lodge, were much more transient. Right. So they would come and go.
So they'd come in, they'd get a job, and then go and find their own accommodation.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So it was kind of like a place to start. So they knew, that they were being sponsored by Christadelphians, but it was very different than coming and living with a family, because when you're with a family, there's more the pressure to be part of the family and to kind of do the same things that the family's doing, to do the readings when the family does it, and that kind of thing. So a lot of people went through the hostels, and they didn't have really any connection to Christadelphia. I should clarify that. A lot of people went through Elpis Lodge, and they didn't have a connection to Christadelphia. Littlethorn, I understand, was different, but I didn't get a lot of information on that. So there was at least one who was in Littlethorn who became a Christadelphian, and then there were a number of different kinder who lived with families who became Christadelphians. Some of them became Christadelphian and then decided to leave. It was kind of like they felt like they were pressured to be with this family, and then when the war was over, they said, "I'm done. Yep. Never mind." Others stayed for their whole lives. So it's kind of each individual has their own story as to what they ended up doing. And
the number of, you said there's approximately 250 people that were sponsored by Christadelphian families and so on, and came through the hostels, etc. Was that through Brother Overton's records, or because you didn't find 250 people, I'm assuming? Where does that number come from?
I did not know. I made contact with something like 35 families. The 250 number actually came from an article in the Christadelphian magazine in the early 2000s by an article by brother Mike Barnes, who was Alan Overton's grandson. He had originally said around 250. So I went with the number that he had said. I didn't try and figure that out. The sad portion about this is somehow all of Alan Overton's records are gone.
Okay.
So nobody knows where they are. Some people, his family, say they went to the University of Southampton, but the university says they have no idea about that. So it's kind of, I don't know. Alan Overton kept the tags from the children, so all the kids came with like a little tag that said like their number, their Kindertransport number, and their name and everything. So he kept the tags of the children that he had rescued, and his son actually showed them to a researcher who was writing her dissertation, I believe in the 90s. But then they were lost after that.
Oh, what a shame.
Yeah.
Just looking at I've got the, I guess the part one, the first volume. You've called it volume one here. And I actually didn't realize there was a volume two. You've got, I don't know, is there about 10 stories in this volume? So have you written another volume with more stories?
Yeah, there's volume 1 and 2.
Wow.
Yeah, volume 1 and volume 2, and they both have 10 stories.
Right.
I have enough for a volume 3, but I haven't done it yet.
Well, I've found this fascinating, and what a great story. And to me, it's such a reminder of the importance of our relationship with God's people, Israel. And it's great to see that this is part of the heritage of the Christadelphian faith. And God willing, we will never lose this, because I think it's just so important.
Yeah, I agree. I think for me, it was a very moving reminder of why what we believe is so important, so crucial, that this has led to lives being saved and people being alive today who wouldn't have otherwise.
Jason, thanks for joining Wilderness Conversations.
Thank you, Steve.